The corridor transfer was 67 hours away when I found her. I'd been running the Alvari pass relay for 11 years, long enough to know every crack in the heating coils, every filing code in the Frontier Compact directory, and every way a draft could thread through the cargo hold when the northwest wind shifted. 11 years of routing transit permits through a station most people couldn't find on a sector chart, and before that, 29 years dispatching corridor traffic at 6 different posts along the Ketharan frontier. 40 years of paperwork. I could recite the welfare assessment form, the full 19A with amendments in my sleep. I probably had. I was 2 weeks from retirement closure. The relay was being decommissioned as part of the jurisdictional transfer. The entire Ketharan frontier corridor, all 14 stations, handed from the Frontier Compact to the Ketharan Colonial Authority on a date the bureaucrats had picked 18 months ago, and the rest of us had been dreading ever since. 14 days, and I'd walk down the mountain with my transit authorization, board a corridor shuttle to Meridian 3, and begin figuring out what a 64-year-old woman does when she stops filing forms. Then I heard something in the cargo hold. Not the wind, I knew the wind. I'd cataloged its moods the way other people catalog music, the low hum through the eastern vents, the percussive rattle against the transit pad shutters, the sustained moan along the ridge when a front moved in from the north. This sound was smaller, closer, alive. The cargo hold hadn't been used for actual cargo in 6 years. The pass route had been reclassified as secondary transit after the valley stations took over the freight allocations, and I'd sealed the hold because it was one less room to heat. The lock was a standard transit authority latch, the kind you could open with a bent stylus if you knew the angle. Apparently, someone had known the angle. She was in the back corner, behind 3 empty freight containers and a stack of decommissioned routing manifests I'd been meaning to recycle for 2 years. Small, still, curled against the wall with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around herself, and even in the dim overhead light I could see the thermal frills along her jawline flat, pressed tight against the skin, like shutters pulled closed against weather. Selvari. I'd processed enough Selvari transit permits over the years to recognize the markers without thinking. Pale silver-blue skin with that faint undertone of gray that cold brought out, dark indigo hair cropped short and uneven, cut by someone who didn't have proper tools, or cut by the child herself. And the frills, the species signature, running from below each ear to the point of the jaw. The frills opened and closed with temperature, and I'd been told by a species liaison officer years ago with emotional state. Flat meant cold, or afraid, or both. She looked at me with copper-amber eyes that were too large for her face, the way Selvari children's eyes always were, and she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. She just watched me the way you watch something that hasn't decided yet whether it's a threat. I've been asked since then what I felt in that moment. People expect tenderness, a rush of protective warmth, some dormant instinct finally stirring after 64 years without children of my own. What I felt was a filing deadline. I knew, the way I knew every form number and every routing clause and every amendment the Frontier Compact had passed in my tenure. Exactly what would happen to an unregistered Selvari child found in a Frontier Compact corridor station 67 hours before jurisdictional transfer. I knew because I'd read Reclamation Protocol 11 when the Ketharan Colonial Authority published it 9 months ago, and I'd read it again when the transfer timeline was confirmed, and I'd read it a third time because I wanted to be wrong about the language. I wasn't wrong about the language. Under the Frontier Compact, the current jurisdictional authority, the system I'd served my entire career, an unregistered displaced minor found in a corridor station was classified as a welfare case. There were forms. There were protections. There was a process that ended with placement, transit authorization, and a welfare escort to a registered care facility or kin match. It was slow and it was bureaucratic, and it generated enough paperwork to insulate a wall. But at the end of it, the child was a person with a file and a destination. Under Reclamation Protocol 11, which took effect the instant the corridor transferred to the Catharan Colonial Authority, an unregistered displaced individual found in a corridor station was classified as an unclaimed territorial resource asset. The process that followed ended with inventory, assignment, and integration into the colonial labor allocation framework. The language was clean. The language was always clean. That was the thing about language: the worse the outcome, the more syllables they used to describe it. The child was currently a person. In 67 hours, she would be a line item. I crouched down slowly, because Selvari children had a wider peripheral visual field than humans. An abrupt movement triggered what the species liaison files politely called an evasive startle response. I held out my hands, palms up, so she could see them. "My name is Brenna," I said. "This is my station. Are you hungry?" The frills stayed flat. The eyes didn't leave my face. I hadn't expected them to. I went to the kitchen. I heated broth, the thick, salted kind I kept for the days when the wind was bad enough to make the heating coils work double, and poured it into the heavy ceramic mug, the one that held warmth longest. I also pulled a thermal blanket from the emergency supply cabinet, not the foil kind. The woven kind, the one that was soft against skin and didn't crinkle like you were wrapping leftovers. I set both on the floor, 3 feet from her, and lowered myself to sit against the opposite wall with the careful choreography of a woman whose knees had filed their own protest years ago. "That's broth," I said, "and a blanket. You don't have to take either one. I'm going to sit here for a while because my knees don't like the cold and it'll take me a minute to get back up anyway." She looked at the mug. Steam curled from it in the cargo hold air. I waited. 40 years of transit work teaches you many things, but the most useful one is this: forms take as long as they take. You don't speed them up by hovering. You file and you wait, and the answer comes when it comes. The waiting is the work. The child reached for the mug, both hands wrapped around the ceramic. The thermal frills along her jaw lifted just barely, just a millimeter of movement as the warmth reached her fingers. I filed that fact the way I'd filed 100,000 observations in my career: frills responsive, thermal regulation functioning, not hypothermic. Whatever had brought her up a mountain pass to an empty cargo hold in a decommissioned relay station, she'd arrived in time. She drank the broth in small, careful sips, watching me over the rim. When she finished, she set the mug down and pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and the frills lifted another fraction. "All right," I said, mostly to myself. I put my hands on my knees and began the process of standing up, which took longer than it used to and made sounds I preferred not to examine too closely. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go to my desk and start filing a welfare assessment. You're going to stay here, or come to the kitchen if you'd rather be warm, or go anywhere in the station you want. There's nothing here that can hurt you and nowhere I won't find you. In the morning, there'll be more broth." She didn't answer. I hadn't expected her to. The species liaison files noted that Selvari children often went nonverbal under sustained stress, not because they couldn't speak, but because the species' survival response involved conserving energy, including the energy of communication. Speech was expensive. Silence was safe. She'd talk when she was ready or she wouldn't. Either way, the filing deadline didn't wait. I walked to my desk. I sat down. I pulled up Form 19A Welfare Assessment for Displaced Minors, Frontier Compact Jurisdiction, and I started typing. Section 1, Location of Discovery. Alvari Pass Transit Relay, Station 7 North, Corridor 14, Catharan Frontier. Section 2, Species Identification. Selvari. Confirmed by thermal frills, dermal coloration consistent with species norms, ocular proportion indicating juvenile stage development. Section 3, Estimated Age. young. The Frontier Compact didn't require precision, minor was sufficient for the initial filing. Selvari didn't age on the same markers humans did, and the species liaison guidelines specifically discouraged station personnel from guessing. She was small. Her frills were short. She fit in the corner behind 3 freight containers. That was enough for Section 3. Section 4, physical condition. Responsive, mobile, thermal regulation functioning, no visible injuries, thin, the way she'd held the mug said she hadn't eaten in some time, and the sharpness of her wrists under the blanket said longer than that. Section 5, identifying markers, woven cord bracelet, left wrist. 2 colors, dark blue and a rust brown I'd barely been able to distinguish in the cargo hold's light. 7 knots in a sequence I didn't recognize but knew enough to log. Selvari kin cord. I'd seen them on transit applications. Each knot pattern identified a lineage group, a family thread, a chain of names going back generations. This child had family somewhere. Whether they were looking for her or alive or reachable, that was a different section. But the bracelet said she'd belonged to someone once, and that someone had tied 7 careful knots to say so. I completed sections 6 through 12 before dawn. Guardian status, none identified. Kin match inquiry, pending. Flight or displacement history, unknown, pending interview if verbal communication became available. Immediate needs assessment, shelter, nutrition, thermal support provided. Safety status, secure, single operator station, no known threats present. Each section had to be filed as an independent sub-filing, because the Frontier Compact, in its infinite procedural wisdom, had designed the welfare assessment as 12 separate submissions rather than one continuous document. 12 submissions, 12 confirmation receipts, 12 opportunities for a routing clerk somewhere down the mountain to lose something in a queue. I filed them all, then I heated more broth. The second day, she came to the kitchen. I don't know what time she woke, or how long she stood in the corridor doorway watching me before I noticed. But when I turned from the stove, she was there, blanket around her shoulders, bracelet visible on her wrist, frills at half-mast. Watching. "There's a chair," I said, nodding toward the table. "It's not comfortable, but neither is the floor, and at least this one gets the benefit of the heating coil." She came in. She sat. She accepted the mug and drank, and I sat across from her with my own cup of the black tea that had been the only thing keeping me functional for 11 years on this mountain. We drank. The wind shouldered against the windows. The heating coils hummed their arthritic hum. "I filed your welfare assessment last night," I told her. "All 12 sections. That means you're in the system now, on paper. You're a displaced minor under Frontier Compact jurisdiction, and you have rights. Those rights include placement, transit authorization, and a welfare escort to wherever you're supposed to be. What they don't include right now is a counter-signature from species liaison, and without that the rest of the chain doesn't move. I'm working on it." She looked at me over the rim of the mug. The frills shifted, a slight fan, then flat again, as if they'd tried something and thought better of it. "I don't know how much of that you understood," I said, "but I want you to know that I am very good at forms, and I intend to complete every single one that stands between you and a transit authorization before the corridor transfer goes through. If that means something to you, good. If it doesn't, that's all right. Either way, the broth is hot." She drank. I drank. And for a few minutes the only sounds were the two of us being warm in the same room, which was enough. I called Merrick mid-morning. Merrick Den had been a corridor dispatcher at the Voss Valley Station for 22 years, and before that, he'd been my trainee at Station 3 South. He was 51 now and still called me ma'am, which I permitted because it made the requests go faster. "Brenna," his voice came through grainy. The mountain relay signal degraded in cold weather, and the weather had been cold for 11 years. "Is it the middle of the night up there?" "It's always the middle of the night up here, Merrick. I need a routing favor." I told him what I needed. A counter-signature routing for a 19A welfare assessment, priority track, through species liaison and medical assessment before the corridor transfer in 59 hours. He was quiet long enough that I heard the Valley Station's ventilation system cycling in the background. Brenna, the handover is in 2.5 days. The routing queue for counter-signatures is backed up 8 days minimum. Everything non-essential got pushed to post-transfer processing. This is a child. I know it is, but the routing system doesn't have a priority category for. Yes, it does. Medical Priority Routing Form 7C under the Frontier Compact Special Circumstances Clause. A displaced minor with a pending medical assessment gets priority routing on all counter-signature requests. It was added in the third-year amendments, Section 14, Subsection 9. A pause. You remember the subsection number. I suggested the language, Merrick. It was my 3rd year on the job. They were going to leave medical priority out of the amendment entirely because the committee chair said it would complicate the routing tables. I told him the routing tables existed to serve the people in them, not the other way around. He put it in. You told the committee chair. I was 27 and I hadn't learned to be diplomatic yet. I've since learned. I'm choosing not to use it. Can you route the 7C? He exhaled. Let me see what I can do. I hung up and looked at the clock. 58 hours, 20 minutes. The child was still at the table. She'd finished the broth and set the mug down with both hands, centering it on the surface with a precision that struck me as habitual, the care of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. The frills were at half-mast. She was watching the window, where the Alvari Pass stretched below in white and gray, the mountain walls rising on both sides, the transit corridor's navigation beacons blinking their patient pattern along the route down to the valley. She pressed one hand against the glass. The frills along her jaw fanned fully, the first time I'd seen them open all the way, and then flattened again, quickly, as if she'd caught herself doing something she shouldn't. I pretended not to notice. Some things aren't for filing. I called Dr. Ashley Pell at the Ketharin Frontier Medical Authority next. She ran the mobile clinic that came through the pass twice a year and owed me precisely one favor. From the time I'd expedited her supply transit permits during the quarantine year when the system was backed up and her clinic was running out of fever suppressants. Ashley, it's Brenna. Brenna, it's early. I'm calling in the favor. It's very early, Brenna. The corridor transfers in 56 hours. I have a Selvari child in my station with no registration, no kin match, and I need a remote medical assessment for the species liaison countersignature. Without it, the 19A stalls and the child. Send me the biometric data. I'll file the assessment as a remote field consultation under Section 9D. It's not standard procedure, but if the data supports the species identification, it will hold. It'll hold through a jurisdictional transfer. It'll hold through anything. I'll put my license number on it. I sent her what I had. The thermal frill observations, the dermal coloration readings from the station's basic medical scanner, the ocular proportion measurements I'd taken while the child was sleeping, carefully, with the scanner on silent mode, because I was not going to startle a Selvari child out of the first real sleep she'd had in however long it had been. Ashley's assessment came back in 4 hours. Selvari juvenile, confirmed, early-stage development, no immediate medical concerns beyond underweight status and environmental exposure effects. License number attached. Priority flagged, medical status declaration enclosed. I filed it, countersignature 1, in progress. By evening of the 2nd day, the child had settled into the station as if the walls had made room for her. She didn't speak. She watched me at the terminal, the form scrolling across the screen, the comms handset going up and down, with an attention that made me think she understood more than she could say, and was choosing not to say it until she was sure. I heated ration stew that night, not broth, but the thicker version with protein strips and the dried root vegetables I'd been keeping in the back of the storage cabinet for the kind of day that required more than soup. I set a bowl in front of her and sat down with my own. She ate slowly, deliberately, the way someone eats when they've learned not to assume the next meal is coming. When she finished, she set the spoon down and looked at me, and the frills stayed lifted. Not guarded, not flat, just present, resting at their natural height, the way I imagined they'd rest if the world weren't a place that kept pressing them down. "You're welcome," I said. She tilted her head. A Selvari gesture, not a nod, not a bow, but a quarter turn, a slight angle of the skull that exposed the frills on one side. I'd seen it in the species liaison cultural notes, filed under nonverbal communication, defined in the dry language of anthropological observation as an acknowledgement of presence. What it looked like, sitting across a table from a child who had just eaten her first real meal in days, was something the cultural notes didn't have a field for. She did it when I gave her food. She did it when I checked the heating coil near her sleeping corner. She did it when I sat down across from her without speaking, just drank my tea while she drank her broth, two people being quiet together in a station on a mountain. "I see you," that's what it meant, close enough. That night after the stew and the quiet, I was at the terminal running a status check on the 7C routing when I heard her move. She'd been in the common room, her corner, the one between the heating vent and the wall, and I'd assumed she was shifting in her sleep. But when I looked up, she was standing in the doorway of my office, watching the screen over my shoulder. I turned my chair. She was holding the thermal blanket around her shoulders like a robe, the edges trailing on the floor, the bracelet visible on her wrist, the dark cords, the 7 knots. In the blue light of the terminal, the silver blue of her skin had a cooler cast, almost translucent, and the frills were at half-mast. Not flat, not fanned. Alert, curious. She took 3 steps into the room and stopped beside my chair, close enough that I could feel the slight temperature difference between her body and mine. 2 degrees cooler, steady, like standing near an open window in early spring. She looked at the screen. Lines of filing code and routing data, confirmation receipts and countersignature status fields, the dense language of bureaucratic process that I'd spent 4 decades learning to read the way other people read weather. She pointed at the screen. One finger extended toward a field in the middle of the 19A status display, the field that read subject, displaced minor, SCLVARI, unregistered. "That's you," I said. "On paper. That's what the system calls you right now, displaced minor, unregistered. By the time I'm finished, it's going to say something different, registered, authorized, protected. Those are better words. I'm working on the better words." She looked at me, then at the screen. Then she sat down on the floor beside my chair, pulled the blanket tight, leaned against the desk leg, and within 10 minutes she was asleep. I kept typing. The terminal hummed. The wind pressed against the walls, and a child slept beside my desk, warm enough and trusting enough to close her eyes while a stranger worked through the night to make the system see her as a person. I thought about that, the weight of it. How little she had and how much of it she'd handed me, not because I'd earned it with anything grand, because I'd heated broth and passed her a blanket and sat across a table and not looked away. That was all. That was the whole mechanism. 40 years of filing forms, and the most important thing I'd ever done was not look away. Day 3, 41 hours to transfer. That's when Dalson arrived. I heard the transport before I saw it, a colonial authority shuttle, the heavy administrative model, landing on the relay's transit pad with the self-important whine that characterized everything the KCA engineered. I watched from the window. The shuttle door opened, and a man stepped out in a gray colonial authority overcoat and boots polished to a shine that had no business on a mountain in winter. Overseer Tolan Dalson. I'd seen the name on the handover scheduling documents weeks ago, Advanced Registrar, the Colonial Authority's designated asset inventory officer for the corridor stations, sent ahead to catalog everything in the Frontier Compact's jurisdiction before the transfer clock ran out. Equipment, supplies, infrastructure, personnel. He came through my door with a datapad and a smile that had never once been warm and wasn't bothering to pretend. Dispatcher Ulseth, I'm here for the pre-transfer asset inventory of Station 7 North. Standard procedure. I'll need access to all operational areas, your equipment manifests, and your current personnel and occupancy records. It's just me, I said. There's no personnel roster to inventory. Single operator station. My retirement closure is filed for 14 days from now, at which point the station transfers to your authority empty. Your occupancy records will confirm that. My occupancy records will confirm one registered operator. That's me. He made a note on his datapad. The stylus moved with the efficient scratch of a man who had done this at every station down the corridor and expected no surprises. Then he looked up, and his eyes went past me, to the kitchen doorway, where a small figure with silver-blue skin and a thermal blanket stood watching him with copper eyes and frills pressed flat against her jaw. Is that individual registered? I have been asked, at various points in my career, to make decisions quickly. The routing error of 14 that would have stranded 400 transit passengers if I hadn't caught the Mies-coded waypoint. The quarantine filing during the fever year when half the valley stations went dark and the other half lost their medical supplies. The night the heating coils failed, and I had to choose between the cargo hold and the communications array, knowing that whichever one I let freeze would stay frozen until spring. None of those decisions were hard, they were just fast. This one was both. She is in the process of being registered, I said. Welfare Assessment, Form 19A, filed with the Frontier Compact 43 hours ago. Counter-signatures are in progress. Species Liaison has the medical verification. Welfare placement is processing, and the full registration will be complete before the transfer window closes. Dowson looked at the child, then at me, then at his datapad. Under Reclamation Protocol 11, he said, any unregistered individual found in a corridor station at the time of jurisdictional transfer is classified as. I know what the protocol says. Then you know that if the registration is not complete before the transfer window, the individual falls under colonial authority jurisdiction, and the classification applies. I know what it says, Overseer. I've read it 3 times. I'm telling you the registration will be complete. He made another note. I'll need to file an asset identification report on the individual as part of the pre-transfer inventory. This is separate from your welfare filing and doesn't interfere with it. Standard procedure. He knew what he was doing. I knew what he was doing. The asset identification report was the first step in a reclamation filing. Once the individual was logged in the Colonial Authority's inventory system, the reclamation classification could precede the instant jurisdiction transferred. He was building his parallel stack. If my welfare registration didn't clear before the window closed, his paperwork would be sitting there, already stamped, already rooted, ready to turn a child into an entry on an allocation spreadsheet. 2 stacks of paper, same child. One said person, the other said property. File whatever you need to file, Overseer, I said. I'll be at my desk. He toured the station, every room, every closet, every cabinet, with the thoroughness of a man counting spoons. I went to my terminal. The child watched him from the kitchen doorway for a moment, the frills flat and tight, and then she came to my desk and sat in the auxiliary chair, the one I used for the backup scanner, which I moved to the floor without comment. She pulled the blanket around her and watched my screen. This, I told her quietly, is what a welfare registration looks like when someone is trying to outfile you. It looks like a lot of typing and a great deal of patience, and I have both. The frills stayed flat. She'd seen the gray coat. She'd seen the datapad and the boots. She didn't know what Reclamation Protocol 11 said, but she knew, the way all children know, what it feels like when someone walks into a room and doesn't see you as a person. That knowledge doesn't require language. It lives in the frills. I called Corva. Corva Dunnell was the welfare placement clerk at Corridor Station 12, the main junction 3 hours down the mountain, where all Frontier Compact welfare filings for this sector were processed. She was 41. I trained her 20 years ago, when she was a junior intake clerk with unreadable handwriting and a routing instinct I recognized because I'd had it once, before I learned to call it expertise instead of stubbornness. Brenna, what's wrong? Corva, listen carefully. I have a 19A in the system, Selvari child, displaced minor, Alvari pass relay. Species liaison countersignature is processing. Medical is filed and confirmed, and I need welfare placement and transit authorization completed before the corridor transfer in. I checked the clock, 39 hours. I also need you to know that there is a colonial authority overseer in my station filing a parallel asset identification report, and if my registration doesn't clear before his jurisdiction kicks in, the child goes into reclamation. Corva was quiet for 3 seconds. In 20 years of knowing her, I'd never heard her be quiet for more than one. What do you need? Pull the 19A from the routing queue and process the welfare placement countersignature directly. You have the authority under Section 14B of the Welfare Placement Manual. The receiving clerk has discretion to expedite processing in cases involving displaced minors under time-sensitive jurisdictional conditions. Brenna, I haven't cited 14B in a decade. It's still in the manual. I checked this morning. You checked? I wrote the training module on it, Corva, page 47. You took the exam. You scored 92. It's still in the manual. She processed it. Countersignature 2, filed by midday. That left species liaison, still routing, and transit authorization. Transit authorization was the last signature and the hardest, because it required a confirmed destination and a receiving party. I couldn't authorize the child's transit to nowhere. Someone at the other end of a corridor route had to be willing and registered to receive her. I pulled up the Selvari Kincord registry. The bracelet on the child's wrist, the dark blue and rust-brown thread, the 7 knots, was a lineage identifier. If I could match the pattern to a registered Selvari kin group, I could file the transit authorization to the group's designated welfare contact and close the chain. The process was designed to take weeks. Intake, pattern analysis, cross-referencing against the kin group directory, confirmation outreach. I had hours, and the registry was a Frontier Compact database that would be archived and locked the moment jurisdiction transferred. I ran the bracelet's knot pattern through the visual matcher, using the scan I'd taken on the second morning, when the child was asleep, and the light was good enough to distinguish the thread colors. 7 knots, 2 colors, 1 match. Lineage, Selvari kin group Tesserath. Registered welfare contact. A Selvari elder named Ren Tesserath, listed at the Selvari resettlement corridor on Verath 7. Active status in the database. Reachable. I sent a priority welfare match inquiry to the resettlement corridor's intake office. Then I sat back and looked at the clock. 36 hours. Your family has a name, I told the child. She was in the chair beside my desk, blanket pulled to her chin, watching the screen with an attention that made me wonder if she could read the filing codes or just the rhythm of my typing. I don't know if they're looking for you or if they know where you are, but they exist and they're in the system, and I've asked them. She looked at me. The frills shifted that half-lift, somewhere between attentive and uncertain, the place where hope and caution share a border. Then she reached out and put her hand on my wrist. Her skin was cooler than mine. Selvari body temperature ran about 2 degrees lower than human standard. I knew that from 40 years of processing medical transit profiles. Her fingers were small, and they wrapped around my wrist the way fingers wrap around something they've decided not to let go of. I put my other hand over hers. "All right," I said. "We're all right." I let a moment pass, then another. The heating coils hummed. The wind pressed against the windows. Her hand stayed. "I should tell you," I said, "that I have spent 40 years in a career that most people consider the dullest possible use of a human life, and this is the first time any of it has felt like it mattered. So thank you for that. Now let me get back to typing." The frills lifted, not all the way, but enough. Dowson filed his asset identification report that evening. I saw it come through the system, a formal entry in the Colonial Authority's pre-transfer inventory, cataloging one unregistered Selvari juvenile discovered at Station 7 North, pending reclassification under Reclamation Protocol 11 upon jurisdictional transfer. The entry was clean, well-structured, correctly coded. He was good at his job. I'll give him that. He was very good at his job. He was sitting in the common room when I came through, datapad on the table, documents scrolling at the unhurried pace of a man who knew time was working for him instead of against him. "I see your filing," I said. "Standard procedure, dispatcher. You've listed her as pending classification. That's accurate given current status. If your welfare registration clears before the transfer, the classification won't apply. The system will note her as a registered welfare case, and my inventory entry closes automatically. No conflict." He was right. There was no conflict as long as my filing cleared first. If it didn't, his inventory entry became the active record, and the reclamation process would begin the moment the Colonial Authority's header appeared on my terminal screen. "You understand that she's a child," I said. He looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, on supply officers who signed off on delayed shipments, on routing supervisors who reassigned personnel without checking the downstream effects, on every administrator who'd ever put their name on a form that shaped a life, and told themselves the form was the point, not the life. I understand that the protocol exists to address a legitimate administrative gap, dispatcher. Unregistered individuals in transfer corridors represent an accountability risk. The classification framework ensures that every individual is accounted for. It's not a judgment on the individual. It's a system. It's a system that turns a child into a freight manifest. It's a system that ensures no one falls through the gaps. What happens after classification is a separate administrative process, and I have every confidence that the Colonial Authority handles it with appropriate procedures. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about explaining what appropriate procedures looked like when the individual on the receiving end was small enough to fit behind a freight container and hadn't spoken in 3 days. I thought about telling him what I'd seen in 40 years of filing forms, how clean language became dirty outcomes, how accountability frameworks became inventory ledgers, how a child with copper eyes and a woven bracelet could pass through a system and come out the other side as a number because nobody along the way had been willing to look up from the routing queue long enough to see her face. I didn't explain any of it. He didn't have a form for it. "I'll be at my desk," I said. Species liaison came through at midnight. Dr. Pell's remote medical assessment had cleared verification, the biometric data matched, the species identification was confirmed, the license number held. Counter-signature 3, done. 3 of 4, 26 hours left. I should have felt relieved. What I felt was the weight of the last signature, the one that needed something I didn't have yet. One left, transit authorization. The kin match inquiry was still pending. The Selvari Resettlement Corridor's intake office had received it. I could see the read receipt logged in the system, but no response. Middle of the night on Verath 7, or a staffing gap. Or the inquiry had landed in someone's queue behind 100 other filings, because every welfare office in the Frontier Compact was drowning in transfer paperwork this week, and a priority inquiry from a mountain relay station wasn't anyone's emergency except mine. I walked to the common room. The child Nev, though I didn't know that yet, was asleep in her corner, curled beneath the thermal blanket, the bracelet resting against the fabric. The frills were lifted in sleep, the way they'd been every night since the first, relaxed, unguarded, the posture of a body that had decided this place was safe enough to stop watching. The heating vent hummed beside her. The common room smelled like ration stew, and the particular dry warmth of coils working overtime against a mountain winter. I stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time, not the way a bureaucrat looks at a case file, the way a person looks at a small living thing that trusts them and feels the full unreasonable weight of that trust pressing down on the part of themselves they'd kept at arm's length for 40 professional years. I had 3 countersignatures. I needed 4. The 4th required a destination I couldn't confirm until a welfare office 7 sectors away opened its queue and answered a message from a woman they'd never heard of, on behalf of a child they might or might not be looking for, about a bracelet they might or might not recognize. And every hour that passed without an answer was an hour the clock used against me. I went back to my desk. I refreshed the inquiry status. Still pending. I refreshed it again because repetition is the prayer of bureaucrats, and it worked about as well. I couldn't wait for it. There was another way to file a transit authorization for a displaced minor without a confirmed kin-match destination. I'd known about it since my first decade on the job, the way you know about the fire extinguisher behind the panel. You check it every year, you note the expiration date, and you hope you never need to pull it. Section 22 of the Frontier Compact Transit Manual, subsection 4, paragraph C. The emergency guarantor provision. A registered Frontier Compact officer could serve as the personal guarantor for a displaced minor's transit authorization by pledging their own credential record as surety. The guarantor's entire file, service history, security clearance, retirement benefits, transit authorization, medical evacuation eligibility, pension access became the backing document for the minor's filing. If anything in the minor's case went wrong, kin-match failure, placement collapse, the child lost in the system, the guarantor's credentials were forfeit, not suspended, not frozen pending review. Forfeit. The backing document couldn't be separated from the minor's case file until the case resolved, and resolution in a system transitioning between jurisdictions could take months, or years, or longer if nobody on the other side prioritized it. I'd seen the provision used twice in my career, both times by officers who understood exactly what they were signing and signed it anyway, because the alternative was worse. I looked at the clock, 27 hours. I looked at my own transit authorization, the retirement document I'd earned after 40 years, the one that would carry me off this mountain and down to Meridian 3 and into the rest of my life. It was sitting in my credential file, clean and countersigned and waiting. 40 years of filing forms had produced exactly one document that was mine and only mine, and it was the one that let me leave. I looked at the kitchen doorway. The child was asleep in the corner of the common room. She'd moved there from the cargo hold on the second night, dragging the thermal blanket with her and settling into the space between the heating vent and the wall as if she'd measured it and found it exactly the right size for one small person who needed to feel enclosed. The frills were lifted in sleep, resting, not flat, not guarded, just at ease, the way they'd been when she drank broth and watched me type and put her hand on my wrist. The bracelet was visible against the blanket, the dark cords catching the low light from the corridor. 27 hours, the kin match still pending, the system still waiting. I pulled up section 22, subsection 4, paragraph C. I read it one more time, slowly, word by word, the way I'd read Reclamation Protocol 11 3 times, because I wanted to be certain I understood what I was giving up and what it would buy. I understood. I started typing. Emergency Guarantor Declaration, Transit Authorization for Displaced Minor. Guarantor, Brenna Ulseth. Frontier Compact Dispatcher, Alvari Pass Transit Relay, Station 7 North, Corridor 14, Ketharin Frontier. Service number 7741BU. 40 years continuous service. Current holder of Retirement Transit Authorization, Medical Evacuation Clearance, Service Pension Access. I, Brenna Ulseth, hereby pledge my full credential record as surety for the transit authorization and welfare placement of the following displaced minor. I typed her description, her species, her condition, the bracelet, the frills, the copper-amber eyes that watched everything and said nothing and understood. I was certain now, more than anyone in any office on any corridor would ever know. Filing reference, Welfare Assessment 19A filed 61 hours prior. Countersignatures, Species Liaison confirmed, Medical Assessment confirmed, Welfare Placement confirmed. Transit Authorization, this document. Backing Credential, Retirement Transit Authorization 7741 BU RET. Medical Evacuation Clearance 7741 BU Med. Service Pension Access 7741 BU Pen. I filed it. The system accepted it with the same flat confirmation tone it used for everything. Routing manifests, supply requisitions, decommission notices, the end of a 40-year career condensed into a single acknowledgement chime. Countersignature 4 complete. The welfare registration was done. All 4 countersignatures filed. The child was, as of 2300 hours station time, a registered welfare case under Frontier Compact jurisdiction, with a confirmed transit authorization backed by a guarantor's full credential record. My credential record. I leaned back in my chair. The terminal hummed. The wind did what it always did. Somewhere in the system, a routing clerk on a night shift would see the filing come through, check the countersignatures, note the guarantor declaration, and move on to the next form in the queue. They wouldn't know what it cost. They wouldn't need to. That's the thing about paperwork. The page doesn't know what it weighs. I walked to the common room. The child was asleep, same corner, same blanket, same posture. Curled on her side, frills lifted, the bracelet resting against the woven fabric like a small, knotted promise someone had tied around her wrist and hoped would hold. The heating vent was doing its steady work beside her, and the room was warm, and she was breathing the slow, even breath of a child who had found a place where the air was the right temperature and the walls didn't move. I lowered myself into the chair across the room, the one I used to use for reading supply manifests on the long winter evenings when the pass was closed and the wind made the walls talk. I sat there and watched her sleep and thought about what I'd just done. I'd signed away my exit, my pension, my medical clearance, my right to leave this mountain and go anywhere the corridor system could carry me, which, until 10 minutes ago, had been anywhere. Now it was nowhere. The system that had been my address for 4 decades didn't know my name anymore, or would stop knowing it the moment the transfer went through. I traded 40 years of accumulated credentials for one line in one child's file, and the line said, "Guaranteed by Brenna Ulseth, service number 7741 BU, who vouches for this child with everything she has, which as of now is nothing, which was always the point." Was it a sacrifice? People would call it that later. I didn't feel it as one. A sacrifice implies you weighed the options and chose the harder one. I didn't weigh anything. I saw what the system would do to her if I didn't file, and I filed. That's not a sacrifice. That's a routing decision. You see the destination, you see the path, you file the form. The fact that the form happened to contain my entire professional life didn't change the routing. It just changed the weight. I sat in the chair and watched her breathe and felt the particular calm of a woman who has done the one thing she was always going to do and now has nothing left except the morning. She spoke to me the next morning. I was at the stove heating broth. It had become the rhythm of us, the broth and the tea and the table and the quiet, a routine so quickly established it felt as if we'd been doing it for years instead of days, when she appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, blanket, bracelet, frills at half-mast. Then she said a word. "Nev." I turned. She was looking at me with those copper eyes, and the frills were lifted, and she said it again, carefully, as if placing it in my hands. "Nev." "Nev," I said, "is that your name?" The quarter turn, the slight angle of the skull, "I see you." "Nev," I said. "All right, I'm Brenna, your Nev. The broth is almost ready." She sat at the table. I set the mug in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it the way she always did, both hands, the full grip, as if warmth were something you could hold and keep, and the frills fanned fully, and she looked at me over the rim, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing the system doesn't have a form number for. That's the thing that weighs more than every credential in my file. 20 hours to transfer. Dowson found out about the completed registration at midday. I heard him at the comm in the common room, speaking to someone at the Colonial Authorities Transfer Coordination Office in a voice that was working very hard to remain level. The welfare registration was filed and completed under Frontier Compact jurisdiction prior to the transfer window. All 4 countersignatures confirmed. Yes, including transit authorization. A pause. Emergency guarantor provision. Section 22. The station dispatcher filed it using her own credential record as backing. A longer pause, during which I imagined the person on the other end of the comm checking the relevant section, and arriving at the same conclusion I'd arrived at 12 hours earlier. "I understand, yes." The Intercompact Recognition Accord, Section 3. "Yes, I'm aware." He came to my desk afterward. His expression was the same as always, composed, efficient, procedurally correct, but behind it something had shifted. Not anger, nothing so useful as anger, bewilderment, the particular confusion of a man who has been outperformed in a competition he didn't realize he was in. "Your registration cleared," he said. "I know. The emergency guarantor provision is an unusual choice. It was the available choice. You understand what you've done. Your retirement transit authorization is the backing document for the minor's welfare case. Your credentials are locked to her file permanently until the case resolves. When the corridor transfers, the Colonial Authority will not recognize your Frontier Compact credentials. Your pension, your medical evacuation clearance, your transit authorization. Everything is tied to a case file that the incoming administration has no obligation to expedite. I know what I did, Overseer. I've been reading fine print longer than you've been wearing that coat. You'll be stranded here. I'll be here. Whether that's stranded depends on whether you think there's a difference between a person who can't leave and a person who chose not to." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the kitchen, where Nev was sitting at the table with her broth, the frills resting at full spread, the bracelet on her wrist catching the light from the window. "Why," he said, "I've thought about that question since. I've turned it over the way you turn a form over to check the back for fine print you might have missed. I've considered the answers that would have been convenient because it was right, because someone had to, because I couldn't live with the alternative, and they're all true, but they're not the answer. The answer is simpler than any of them and harder to fit on a form. Because the alternative was a filing code that turned her into a line on a freight manifest," I said. "And I've moved enough freight in my life to know the difference between cargo and a child." He left that afternoon. His shuttle lifted off the transit pad and banked down the valley toward the next station on his inventory list, and I watched it go, and I didn't feel anything about it, because Tolan Dowson wasn't the antagonist of this story. He was a form. The system filled him in the way it filled in any other field, efficiently, correctly, without asking what the field was for. The kin match response came through 14 hours before the transfer. I was at my terminal, running the numbers on how long a person could reasonably live in a decommissioned relay station on a mountain with a functioning heating system and a 6-month supply of ration stew, when the message appeared. Ren Tesserath, Selvari Community Elder, Verath 7 Resettlement Corridor. We have been searching for this child for 91 days. The bracelet confirms her lineage. Please send her home. 91 days. 3 months. The knots on the bracelet had been tied by someone who'd spent 3 months not knowing where the child was, and the message was 4 sentences long, and the last 2 words were "send her home." And I sat at my desk and put my hand over my face for a moment, because there are some things that 40 years of professional composure don't prepare you for. I filed the transit routing. Alvari Pass relay to Corridor Station 12, Corridor Shuttle to Meridian 3, Intersector Transit to Verath 7. Corva arranged the welfare escort personally, someone with Selvari cultural training, someone who would know about the frills. Every leg documented, every transfer filed, every handoff logged in the system with the precision of a woman who understood that paperwork was the only architecture standing between a child and a classification number. I told Nev that evening. I sat across from her at the table, our table, the one with 2 chairs and 2 mugs and the heating coil's warmth pooling between us like a third presence. And I told her that someone named Ren Tesserath was waiting for her on Verath 7, and that the bracelet on her wrist was the proof, and that I had filed the route, and that a woman was coming in the morning to walk her all the way there. She listened. The frills cycled up, then down, then up, a pattern I hadn't seen before, a rhythm that wasn't fear and wasn't calm but something between the two, the place where knowing you're safe and knowing you're leaving share the same breath. She got up from the table and walked to me and put her hand on my wrist again. Small fingers, cool skin, the grip that said "I'm here and don't go and I see you," all at once, in a language that didn't need words because words were too expensive for what it meant. "I know," I said. I put my hand over hers. "But the forms are filed and the escort is coming and you're going home. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you because I am an old woman who has filed a great number of forms in her life, and this is the last one that matters, and it is done." The quarter turn. "I see you too, Nev." The escort arrived the next morning, 6 hours before the corridor transfer. A young woman in a Frontier Compact welfare uniform, calm, quiet, trained. She had a transit case with a change of clothes and a meal pack, and she stood in the common room with the professional gentleness of someone who had done this before and understood what the frills meant. Nev stood in the doorway of the station with the thermal blanket still around her shoulders. I'd told her she could keep it. It wasn't on the equipment manifest, I'd checked, and even if it had been, I'd have scratched it off. Some things don't belong to inventories. Some things belong to children who need to be warm. She looked at me. The frills were fully fanned, open, resting, unhurried. The copper eyes held mine, and what I saw in them wasn't the watchful calculation of the cargo hold or the guarded half-attention of the first morning. It was the look of someone who has decided what they are going to remember. I crouched down. My knees protested the way they always protested, loudly, specifically, with the accumulated grievances of 64 years and 11 of them on a mountain. And I didn't care, because there was a child in front of me who was about to walk through a door I'd spent 72 hours building out of forms and filing codes, and one old woman's refusal to let a deadline win. "Listen," I said, "you're going to get on that shuttle and the woman beside you is going to take you to Verath 7, and someone named Ren is waiting for you there. You are going to be all right. The paperwork says so, and I have never in 40 years filed paperwork that was wrong." The frills fanned, the quarter turn, small fingers on my wrist, one last time a grip and a release, both in the same gesture, the way you hold a door open and step through it. Then she let go. She walked to the escort. She looked back once from the shuttle door, and the frills were up, and the bracelet caught the morning light, and then the door closed, and the shuttle lifted off the transit pad, and it banked south toward the valley, and I watched it until it was a point against the gray sky, and then until it wasn't, and then I watched the sky for a while longer because my knees needed a reason to wait before I tried standing up. The corridor transferred 6 hours later. I felt it the way you feel a pressure change before a storm, nothing visible, nothing audible, just the sense of one thing ending and another beginning. The terminal on my desk cycled through a shutdown sequence, went dark for 3 seconds, and came back with a new header. KETHARAN Colonial Authority, Corridor 14, Station 7 North, login required. My access was gone. 40 years of service credentials, the routing codes, the filing permissions, the welfare assessment clearances, the dispatch authority that had let me move forms and people, and one small child through a system built on ink and countersignatures, archived under the outgoing jurisdiction's closed records. My retirement transit authorization, my medical evacuation clearance, my pension, all locked to Nev's case file, which was now in the Frontier Compact's transfer archive, tagged for intercompact processing at a pace measured in months or years, depending on how many people in the new administration considered a closed welfare case worth prioritizing. The terminal didn't know my name. I was a single operator in a decommissioned station on a mountain in a corridor that belonged to an authority that had no record of me, no obligation to me, and no particular reason to care whether I was here or not. I sat at my desk. The screen glowed with the Colonial Authority's login prompt, asking for credentials I no longer had, and I looked at it the way I'd looked at 40 years of forms, as a problem with a structure, a set of fields with blanks, a system that could be navigated if you knew where to find the right paragraph. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did. The heating coils were doing what they always did. The station was the same walls, same windows, same kitchen where I'd heated broth every morning for 11 years and twice more for a child who needed it. Her mug was on the counter, ceramic heavy, the kind that held warmth. I picked it up. It was cold. Everything was cold now except the memory of small fingers on my wrist and a quarter turn that meant I see you from a child who was, at this moment, on a shuttle heading south with a welfare escort and a woven bracelet and a registration number that said she was a person in every system that mattered, because an old woman on a mountain had filed the right forms in the right order before the clock ran out. I set the mug down. I pulled my chair closer to the desk. I opened a blank document on the terminal Colonial Authority format, unfamiliar headers, different field labels, but not incomprehensible, because a form is a form is a form, and 40 years of reading them means you can read any of them, even the ones that haven't learned your name yet. I started typing. A new credential application. A request for temporary residency status under the Colonial Authority's incoming personnel provisions. It would take time, maybe a great deal of time. The mountain didn't care. The mountain had always had time, and so, it turned out, did I. Somewhere south, a shuttle was carrying a child with copper eyes and 7 knots on her wrist toward a family who had been counting the days. She was in the system. She was registered. She was, by every filing code and countersignature and guarantor declaration I had spent a career learning how to use, a person with a name and a destination and a way home. I drank my tea. It had gone cold while I wasn't paying attention. I drank it anyway. Cold tea, warm station, a blank form on the screen, and all the time in the world to fill it in. That was the last form that mattered. Everything else was just paperwork.